and this is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Hi everyone. I would just like to start by acknowledging the Dharawal-speaking people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present, and future. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Tammy Reardon, who is a guide at the Isle of the Dead. Welcome, Tammy.
Hi, it's lovely to see you.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Paidurumi Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. They're elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you. So tell us about the Isle of the Dead. How long have you been working there as a guide?
On and off, I've been working as a guide at Port Arthur for 15 years.
Wow.
My interest, however, goes back to my early teens when my first job was a volunteer archaeologist on site.
That must be fascinating.
It was absolutely incredible, and it started me on this this path to become a guide. So I've been working on the island for 15 years, on and off, and Isle of the Dead is the final resting place of those that died at Port Arthur during the convict era, so between 1833 and 1877.
And where is it for those people who have never visited? Where can we find it?
Well, as the name would suggest, it's an island.
Yep.
It's out in the middle of our harbour. It's probably about a kilometre offshore from the male prison, and only a few hundred metres from Point Pua, which was the first established juvenile detention centre within the.
So we're in Tasmania, in Hobart, near Port Arthur.
Yeah, so most people know where Port Arthur is. It's about an hour and a half out of Hobart. It's, you know, one of the tourism destinations for people visiting Port Arthur. And of course, it's very important to local history as well. So we get visitors.
And is it a big place?
Port Arthur itself, the historic site, just Port Arthur, is about 100 acres.
Okay. And the Isle of the Dead?
The Island of the Dead's only 2.2 acres.
Oh, okay. So what can we see when we go there?
You'll see a little island that appears to be a rocky nub in the middle of the harbour. You'll climb onto the jetty from the Marana. We have to arrive obviously by boat, and we'll walk on these walkways just above where the people are buried. And unfortunately for the convict burials, they were in unmarked graves.
Is that because they couldn't afford their own headstones?
Well, to start off with, it was because the Reverend John Allen Manton, he said that they were sinners in life and should be forgotten in death.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah, and then transportation of convicts to Van Diemen's Land ended in 1853, so rules were relaxed.
Yeah.
And that's when we have a few memorial stones being placed out there on the island for the convicts. And there's only 9 of those.
Okay. And then so there's free settlers there as well, officers, Marines. Yep. So how did they separate? Did they separate them, or are they just thrown in together?
No, they certainly separated them. The Port Arthur Historic Site is set up so that if you're a free person, if you're a soldier, you live high on the hills with the convicts below in the valley.
Right, so there's even a class system in death.
Oh, totally. And it is very evident on the island that class system still exists. On the low end of the island, we've got around 900 convicts, lunatics, paupers and boys from Point Pua buried. And on the top side of the island, there's approximately 200 soldiers, free officers and their families buried up there as well.
Right. So if I am searching for a convict, a particular convict, how would I find them? Is it all mapped out somewhere? Do we know where?
On site
Yeah,
or
either. Like, how can I find the spot where my ancestor is?
if you're a convict, we can't.
Right. Okay. But you do have a list of people that are buried there?
An incomplete one.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it appears that there is a gap. I think they're Catholic burials, but there were fires where we know records were destroyed. So we believe there's about 600 that we don't know of their names. And even if you go through the records, having a look at the death and burial records online, which is very accessible through the Tasmanian library system, it isn't always clear as to whether they were buried on the island, because on the peninsula we've got several satellite sites. We've got the coal mines, we've got the Invalid Station, Quarantine Station at Premedina. And if they died out in those outlying areas, they would occasionally be buried on the island, but there are other graveyards out there as well. So can't always say definitively if that person's buried there. If it's a free person, it's much easier, but we still don't even know where most of those are, because there's only 80 headstones for 200 people.
Oh, okay. Do we know anything about the funerals? Did they, did the convicts get any sort of ceremony?
Well, we do, and I just bought, just give me a moment. I can find a description of the last burial. We do know that there were coffin makers on site, and there is an abundance of timber, so it's reasonable to assume that they were buried in coffins rather than sailcloths and buried like that. But the last convict burial on the island, it talks about, who was it written by? Oh, it was a newspaper columnist. During my last day at Port Arthur, I attended the funeral of, I believe, the last prisoner who was buried on Dead Island. The man was in the hospital for some considerable time, and when pronounced in a dying state, his wife was sent for from Glenorchy. Now, we need to remember that this is towards the end of the prison system, and that rules were very relaxed at this point. This was not always the case for the men. Unfortunately, she arrived too late and he'd already died. The body was conveyed from the hospital to the church upon the shoulders of 4 men, the bell being tolled at intervals meantime. Here the usual portion of the burial service took place, after which the coffin was conveyed down the Oak Avenue to the landing place, where 2 boats were in waiting, one manned by a crew all dressed in white, the other empty. Into the latter the coffin was lowered, and those attending the funeral having taken their seats in the former boat, the coffin was taken in tow and a start made across the bay to Dead Island. Slowly and solemnly we proceeded on our course without a sound save the measured dipping of the oars and the ripple of the water neath the boat. Landing upon the rocky ledge, a procession was formed, which was conducted by the gravedigger over and among the graves of those already buried there, until we reached the spot where the last of the convict inhabitants was to be interred. The rest of the service was read by the chaplain, the grave filled up, and a return made in the dusk of the evening.
Wow.
So these men did receive the normal funeral procession and attendance, which seems a little out of place when they had no gravestones and no real true memorials.
Yeah. What about the direction that they're buried? I once read that depending on your religion, your body might be facing east, or do you know anything about that?
What I do know is that the convicts tended, well, we don't know what direction they're buried in because we don't have headstones as such.
So we've never done an archaeological dig to...
No. There was a very brief attempt at doing ground penetrating radar readings, and I believe they got about half a day done out there, and somebody put a stop to it. I'm not sure why, how it was prevented, and I'm having trouble finding the report that they did. The thing was with the island though is it's quite acidic soil, so there would be very little remnants of remains.
Okay.
What they would be able to discover is the positions of the graves, and that's about it. That's still not going to tell what direction the head is at. Most, I would say, just by looking at the layout, they're probably facing north, the same as the free people. So, which is interesting. Most of them are facing north. There is one grave, however, that faced west, which is the grave of one of the wives of one of the officers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So have you looked into the lives of any of these convicts?
I have.
Can you tell us one of your favourites?
Well, the convicts, their records are really quite easy to find. Luckily, the records in Tasmania, the convict records, are incredibly complete, and we learn a lot of information. And I don't know, it's hard choosing just one story. And actually, my focus is often on the free people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because their stories go untold a lot here at Port Arthur.
Yeah, I imagine they would be.
On our walking tours, we've got all these little signposts out here that have individual stories of convicts. So a lot of my focus is on free people. But one of the more interesting stories that I like to tell on a tour would be the story of Henry Savery. He's an atypical convict. So Henry Savery is from a very wealthy background. He arrived in Van Diemen's Land as a result of basically forging promissory notes in order to keep his sugar refinery businesses up and running. He'd married a very wealthy woman, and he wanted to keep her in the lifestyle that she was accustomed to.
Of course.
So he started, of course, one has needs.
Yes.
So he arrives, and because he's one of the few convicts that has any skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, despite the fact that he's embezzled and been convicted of forgery and fraud, they put him to work in the Treasury Department.
It seems like a logical place to put it. Convict,
of course. So he works there. He works diligently. He works quickly. He's got a bit of free time. He's allowed to earn money for working for others, and he gets a ticket of leave. And so he asks permission to have his wife and son sent over. Now, as a woman, his wife can't travel alone. She has to be accompanied by a man. And luckily, her father's friend, a man by the name of Algernon Montague.
Wow, that is a name, isn't it?
That's a name.
Can you say that again?
Algernon Montague.
Wow.
He's coming out to be a judge. So she's on board the ship. She arrives in Hobart, and it's a very small community. So she's already faced with the fact that her husband is an ex-convict. And when she arrives, she discovers that she's actually become the scandal of the town. There's rumours and reports that there's been a liaison.
Oh, on the ship out here.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Do tell.
Whether that happened or not is a matter of pure speculation. But in a
Who was it
small
with?
town with Algernon.
Oh, wow. That is scandalous.
Very scandalous. So you can imagine arriving, you're already on the back foot because your husband's an ex-convict. You've been branded a scarlet woman. But it hasn't been an easy journey for Staveley. Savery. Savery, before he even boards a ship in England, he's rather concerned that he's going to be hanged. So, because at the time, to be charged with the amount of fraud that he's been convicted of, it's a case of hung, drawn and quartered.
Yeah.
So he actually, before he's even nabbed, he's boarded a ship to go to America to start this new life. And as he's on board the boat, he watches a police boat row towards him, and he knows it's for him because his business partner's on board. So rather than be taken, he jumps overboard and tries to commit suicide.
Oh, wow.
Death rejects him. He bobs up to the surface. He immediately starts to beat his head against the ship, trying to dash his brains out.
Oh, my goodness.
Death rejects him again. He's brought up by the police, thrown into a cell. He's got to fully be recovered before he can face trial.
Yeah.
And that's where they sentence him to death. They give him 20 days to put his affairs in order. But on the 19th day, his lawyer walks in and says, well, you're not dying tomorrow. They're going to transport you instead. So that's when he arrives, works with the government. His wife arrives and she realises that all is not well. Immediately wants to return home. And he's heartbroken.
Yeah, he's waited all that time.
All these years, done the right thing, and she's going to leave. So he goes home and slits his throat.
Oh, no.
But death rejects him.
Again. Wow.
The doctor sews him up. He's on the road to recovery. His wife has left. He is becoming quite disgruntled with the system, and he starts writing letters to the newspaper under a pseudonym. And it's during this time that he pens a novel called Quintus Servanton. And it's almost like I have to admit, I've not read the full book. One of my colleagues has. It took us 6 months to go through it. It's a hard read.
Yeah.
But he wrote this book. And then he goes back to his old ways. He's charged with forgery again and ends up at Port Arthur. An author, David Burns, describes coming across Henry Savery in the hospital, describes him as a broken man, a man that has wounded himself again. He's reopened the wounds on his throat.
Oh, gosh, this is terrible.
But death rejects him again. It's only a few short months later that death comes knocking and comes collecting. Henry Savery dies in the hospital at Port Arthur as a result of what they call paralysis, which is likely to have been a stroke.
Oh, I see.
He has.
It's awful.
They're not happy stories.
No,
they're not happy stories.
That's a particularly sad story.
But he left a legacy. Henry Savery remained in an unmarked grave. It's still an unmarked grave, technically speaking, but he was unrecognised until the early 1970s, when a literary award, the Henry Savery Award, it started to be handed out, because Henry Savery is actually Australia's first published novelist.
Oh, wow. Well, that's nice.
And so he now has a memorial out there on the Isle of the Dead. The current memorial's only been out there since about 1993.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very new addition to the island.
Okay. Wow. Any others you'd like to share with us?
Well, how long have we got? My current, I started a journey. What's it? It's the 5th today, isn't it?
It is.
It's a year today that I started my journey with the Staveley family. So, because
tell me about them.
Today is the anniversary of the death of one of their children buried on the Isle of the Dead. And so,
are they convicts?
No, these are free people. And this is where, a lot of my interest lies, because, as I said, they're usually untold stories. So the Staveley family have 3 children buried on the Isle of the Dead. Their firstborn child, John Thomas, he was 2.5 years old when, sadly, he drowned here at Port Arthur. And we have a lily pond on site where I think is probably the site of his death. His father was originally arrived in Australia as a soldier and comes down here to Port Arthur as a guard, and eventually resigns and becomes a constable, a police officer. And he's here a couple of times at Port Arthur. So John is sadly the firstborn, the first to die. He's buried on the island. His sister Julia, she's only 5 months old when she dies of whooping cough.
Sadly, that was quite common, wasn't it, to lose children?
Yeah, childhood diseases is one of the most common causes of death amongst about 52 children that are buried on the island. So it's actually the anniversary of her death today. Okay. And then their 18-year-old son, George, he died of bronchopneumonia. But what concerned me is that he was listed as being unemployed due to blindness.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if George was born blind or whether he became blinded in later life. But I often think what it must have been like for a young man, 18 years old, to be living as a free person in a prison, unable to see. It must have been terrifying. And unfortunately, their mum, Elizabeth, also died here at Port Arthur. She has no headstone. There is no record of where she is buried on the island, but with all 3 children in the same grave, it kind of stands to reason that perhaps she's there with them.
Yeah, so it's a big chance.
Yeah. But the question that I was asked on a year ago, they wanted to know, the visitors wanted to know if there were any other children and what happened to them afterwards. And generally speaking, I only know the very basic outline, enough to do a tour. But I started to delve deeper into this family and discovered that there were 8 children in total. And of the 3 that I've been following, we have Mary Jane. Now, Mary Jane grew up and married a jailer. And she was born here at Port Arthur in a jail, and she was raised herself in a jail. She goes on to marry a jailer and raise her children in Hobart Jail.
Wow.
Her brother, Charles, he is raised in the jail. He's born in the jail, and he grows up and he becomes a police officer. And part of his time, he's working here on the peninsula over at Impression Bay, Invalid Station, so an institution. And that's where he raises his family, in an institution as he had been done. And the last one, Matilda, I really held such high hopes that she would get out of the system.
Yeah.
Because I knew that she was the black sheep of the family. I discovered that Matilda had 3 children to 3 men, but she only married once. Now, today, we wouldn't even blink at that, but I should have imagined that back in the day, it was an absolute scandal.
I bet.
So one of the firstborn child, she fell pregnant to a man here at Port Arthur. She was still living here as a young woman, fell pregnant to one of the storekeepers. And I didn't know for a very long time what happened to that child because I couldn't find any trace of him. It was a little boy. The second child was to her husband, Frederick Easton, and I had my suspicions that he was a bit of a cad. And then I found an excerpt in the newspaper that less than 6 months after marrying her and making her a stepmother of 5 of his children, he abandoned her and he was charged with abandonment. But he must have gone back to her because they have this baby. But unfortunately, little Matilda, she passes away when she's 3 years old. The third child that she has is also called Matilda, and her father was a nurse, and the child was born at New Norfolk. And what you might not know is that at New Norfolk there was an asylum.
Okay.
And that's important in the story because I've lost you again. 2 of her children were actually born. The last 2 children were born at New Norfolk. And I don't know what really happened to the last child either. But fast forward, at the age of 48, Matilda's picked up on the streets of Hobart. She's charged with being idle and disorderly, which is essentially homeless, without someone to care for her. They put her into prison, into jail, where her sister is living, ironically. She's jailed for a month. Then they move her to the Newtown Charitable Institution, where she reports that she's attacked by 3 men. Now, in response to this, the doctor reports that she is excitable in character. She refuses to eat. She doesn't take her medicine. She won't wash. She becomes increasingly violent towards any that try and give her direction.
Sounds like she's a victim of abuse. That's
sounds like post-traumatic stress and trauma to me, but I'm no expert. But what the system says is that she's now a lunatic, and she's sent to out to New Norfolk Asylum for 15 years. Wow. And that's where she'll die.
Oh, that's so tragic.
This woman that's been born and raised in a prison becomes institutionalized as well. The sad thing is that I do now know what happened to her 2 other children. Thanks to, I did a talk at Port Arthur about the Staveley family, and it was advertised, and some descendants saw it and reached out.
Fantastic.
So they were able to tell me they were actually descendants of Matilda's 2 missing kids.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So they both survived. It appears that they were both fostered out and raised by other people, and have now got their own descendants out there in the world.
Gosh. Do you have any convict ancestry?
I have a lot of convict ancestry.
Yeah. Is this how you became a guide? Is it?
It is. I only knew of one when I started working here. My 4 times great grandfather, Bartholomew, he was a convict at Port Arthur. I also have my other 4 times great grandfather. He was a constable on Point Pua.
Is that how you pronounce it? Point Pua.
Pua. Yeah.
And that was for children, wasn't it?
It was for boys. Yeah. Just boys between the ages of 9 and 18.
And if anything happened to them, were they buried at the Isle of the Dead?
Yeah, sadly, we have around 80 lads from Point Pua buried out there.
80?
That sounds like a lot. I know it sounds like a lot. But when you consider what's happening back in Britain, 50% of children don't survive to their 18th birthday.
True, yeah.
And then, so what we're getting are the survivors of that. So they're already strong enough to survive all that out there, and they're brought back into Point Pua. Now, we had 3,000 boys go through the system in the 15 years that it's a prison, and with a 50% life expectancy, 80 as opposed to 1,500. That's a pretty low number.
Yeah, when you look at it like that.
Yeah, yeah. And the death rate here at Port Arthur, it was comparable with anywhere else at the time. Despite the hardships, despite the working conditions, the living conditions here, the prisons were scrupulously clean. They were scrubbed every day. They were lime washed, which is a natural antiseptic. The men had to bathe once a week. I know, tragic. But a lot of them wouldn't have had those opportunities, back on the streets of London or Manchester or wherever they were from.
That's right. It's important to put it into context because, a lot of convicts, before they became criminals, they didn't know where their next feed was coming from. They didn't have a roof over their head. So for some, prison was a luxury because they did know that they were going to get breakfast and dinner every day, and they did have the security of a roof over their heads.
And I think some of them become institutionalised, and that's why they become repeat offenders, because, and we still see it in modern society today.
Oh, definitely.
They're released from prison, they don't know how to work a bank account, they don't know how to, apply for jobs, and it's easy for them to go, well, I just have to do what I'm told in there.
Yeah.
They're going to feed me, clothe me, they're going to put a roof over my head. If I keep my head down, I can, just.
And you can
just
imagine
survive.
the stress of trying to find a meal for your family every day, having no money. How am I going to do this? Like, the stress would be incredible.
Yeah.
So to be in the prison system and think, I don't have to even think about that. I just have to focus on work. I can dream about what I can do when I get out and when I finish.
And for some of the prisoners, that it was the beginning of the beginning rather than beginning of the end.
Yeah.
We have let me think. Aylett. We have a family. It's not Aylett. Yes, it is. It's Aylett. We have a woman buried out on the Isle of the Dead. She died of consumption when she was 38, but it was actually her father-in-law that first came out to Australia as a convict. He was a kitchen gardener, an orchardist. He becomes an orchardist, and when he completes his sentence, he can go back to England. He can go back to his wife and his 2 kids. But there's no chance of him ever owning an orchard.
That's right. They had a lot better prospects after they'd completed their sentences to start anew, start afresh, and start businesses and really make something of their lives. And I think a lot of people, wanted to stay for that reason. I do know that Britain wasn't exactly encouraging them to come back. They had to pay their own fare to come back, which would have been a huge amount to be able to save that and go back. But the opportunities it was worth staying and starting a new life. And I know a lot of them wrote home and said to their families, come on out. And I often wonder if people deliberately, turn to crime to get the passage out here.
There is evidence that did happen on occasion where you've got somebody coming out to pave the way, and then you'll have other families, members commit, crimes to be sent out. I remember quite some years ago, actually, I met a descendant of someone on site And they were telling me how their ancestor, their 4 times great-grandfather, had been convicted as a convict and transported on the same ship his wife travelled. She was free. She was a free woman, but she travelled with him on the ship. And when they arrived, generally the ship would be held, the convicts would be on the ship for 2 or 3 days, quarantine, getting paperwork in order. But anyone free could jump off the boat and head into Hobart. And she went and bought a pub.
Wow.
And then she would have turned to the authorities and said, oh, I wouldn't mind a convict servant. Oh,
yeah, imagine having your husband assigned to you.
That's exactly what happened. And one of the if I retell that story, sometimes some of the husbands go, yeah, that's a life sentence in itself. But she had a husband assigned to her, worked in the pub, and basically started a new life, and their family had stayed in Australia.
Yeah.
But the Aylets eventually came out. By the time he could afford to get his family out here, he had left behind his son, who had been 6 years old. And by the time they were reunited, James Jr. was 30.
Oh, okay.
Married with a family of his own, and it was his wife that's buried out there on the Isle of the Dead now. So by his dad coming out as a convict, it paved the way for them to come out and live in Australia.
So the ferrymen that would take the bodies over to the island, the people that were making the coffins and doing the services, were they convicts themselves? Do you know?
Certainly the boat crew would have been convicts. The coffin makers would have been convicts. We did however, free ministers. And we had both Anglican and Catholic priests here at Port Arthur. So, and generally they fell somewhere within that range. So either of the ministers would perform the services. They go out on the boat and perform the service over the grave as well.
But it seems really it seems surprising that they gave convicts a boat to use. No one ever tried to use it for an escape?
That's a whole nother story.
Okay.
Not the boats that took the bodies out, but our commandant had his boat stolen.
Oh, really? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, they're building boats here. They're teaching convicts how to build boats and ships, which seems very odd to me. I mean, you'd be a bit concerned if you went into a modern prison today and found them learning how to build tanks. Like how to bust out of jail in one swift move. And of course, there's a story about the Sarah Island, where the last ship built on Sarah Island was stolen by the convicts and made its way to Chile.
That's right. Yeah, that's a great story.
It's a great story. But of course, there is one person we're forgetting, the important role of the gravedigger.
Oh, of course, yes. Who was that?
Well, we have a series of them, but we do have 2 very well documented stories of gravediggers who actually lived on the island.
Okay.
Mark Jeffery, he wasn't out there for a lot of time, but he was the last convict gravedigger. And there's a bit of an interesting story about him, that they put him out there at his own request. He was a pretty violent man, and he caused them a lot of headaches whenever they locked him up. So that might have helped the decision to send him out. He was a very religious man, so every Saturday night they'd go out and pick him up, bring him down, and he'd go into a cell in the penitentiary so that he could attend church on Sunday. He'd get his supplies, and they'd take him back onto the island. But one night, he lit a signal fire. And when the soldiers got out there, they discovered that he was in a state of agitation, and he refused to stay on the island. They demanded that he take him off, because he'd had what he called a visitation from his satanic majesty.
Okay.
So he came back. Eventually, a few months later, they sent him back out onto the island, and he was one of the last 8 convicts to be removed from Port Arthur when it closed as a prison.
Wow.
The other gravedigger, there's an interview that Anthony Trollope, the author.
Oh, yeah.
He came down here to Port Arthur and spoke to quite a lot of convicts, etc. But he was fascinated with the idea of a man living on the Isle of the Dead. And he said, but of all the men, the most singular in his fate was another Irishman, one Baron, who lived on a little island all alone. And of all the modes of life into which such a man might fall, surely his was the most wonderful. To the extent of the island, he was no prisoner at all, but might wander whither he liked, might go to bed when he pleased and get up when he pleased, might bathe and catch fish or cultivate his little flower garden, and was in very truth monarch of all he surveyed. King of the dead. I love it.
Wow. It must be interesting to delve into all the lives that people surrounding this island.
Fascinating. And I myself do have an ancestor buried on the Isle of the Dead.
Oh, wow.
So my 4 times great uncle, William Doody, he was one of my few non-convict ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
He arrived in Australia as a pensioner soldier, came out as a guard, ended up here at Port Arthur working, and when he retired from the army, they made him a constable at Eagle Hawk Neck.
Oh, yeah.
So he was promoted to chief constable. So it was up to him to go out chasing ex-convicts, or escaped convicts, I should say. And so one day he was set off to chase down this convict with his constables. They caught up with the convict, and William sent them all back here to Port Arthur. Well, he had to remain in a town that's now called Madonna, which is not too far. It's up on the next peninsula, waiting for the mail to come in. Hadn't been able to get to Port Arthur because of storms for 2 days, prevented it from getting through the heads. And so while he was up there, unfortunately, he crossed a bridge over what's called the Sounds Rivulet, and the inquest says that he slipped and accidentally, casually, and by misfortune, drowned.
Casually drowned.
I'd hate to see him do it in a business-like manner.
It's such an odd way to say it, isn't it?
It is a very odd way to say it. And he left behind a wife and 2 young children, left them penniless. She applied for a pension, but they wouldn't give her a pension. They gave her a stipend of, I think, £10, which is a considerable amount of money.
Oh, okay.
But she did have to provide for those children, without a husband to provide for them.
Yeah, times are tough, weren't they?
It would have been extraordinarily difficult for her. So now every time I go out onto the Isle of the Dead, I get to visit one of my ancestors.
Oh, that's a nice connection.
It is, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. It's such a fascinating place.
Endlessly fascinating, endlessly.
And how can we see one of your tours? You're still a guide there?
Oh, I certainly am. They'll be carrying me out in a box. it's the Isle of the Dead is one of our additional tours. So when you visit Port Arthur, you get a 2-day pass, which is great.
Oh, okay.
At the moment, unfortunately, with COVID, things are subject to change very quickly.
Yeah.
But the 2-day pass essentially gets you an introductory walking tour. So it's 40 minutes, just an overview of the history of Port Arthur and a stroll through the site. It also includes your harbour cruise, so a 20-minute jaunt. Yeah, it's a 20-minute jaunt on the harbour with commentary. But you can pay an additional amount to hop off the island for a 40-minute tour.
Excellent.
And, we all love all the guides. I don't think there's a guide that doesn't love the Isle of the Dead tour, because it is one of the few opportunities we really get to the nuts and bolts, and we get to introduce people of Port Arthur, because when you talk about death, you have to talk about life. It's a natural progression.
Yes, that's so true. Oh, fantastic. Well, I might leave links in the show notes so that people know where they can find you and come and do one of your amazing tours.
We've got some very, very passionate guides, so it doesn't matter whose tour they get out on. They'll be sure to be very entertained and very informed.
And I think with all this knowledge inside your brain, you need to put it on paper and give us a book to read all about it.
Oh, you know, I think there's a few in there, but you know, busy guiding. There's no time to sit and write.
I know, and you just want to research more and more and more.
That's what I do. I go home and do research. It's like, you know, I'm not getting paid for this. So, it's fun.
No, I get it.
Keeps me out of trouble, as my mum would say.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Tammy. And hopefully, I'm hoping that you will come on the show again and tell us another aspect of convict lives.
Oh, there's plenty of information about Port Arthur and convict lives to discuss, isn't there? Always.
Oh, yeah.
And I would love to.
Thank you. All right. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.